Hi and welcome back. So it recently occurred to both Mike and I that we've actually not done a load of reviews for products that we've actually had for quite a long time. Now, we're not involved with any of these businesses. Like Black Fencer, for example, we give them a lot of advice and talk to them a lot, the actual guys that run it. And that's because we want to get the best products available. But we have no financial connections to them. We just want to get good training swords, particularly for things like sabers and spadroons, stuff like that, which realistically were really badly catered for and over the years. So yeah, that's our involvement there. But anyway, the thing that I wanted to talk about today was the Sharp Simulator Sabre. So here's a normal V5 1796 infantry sabre in synthetic form. So this was the first ever, the prototype. Now, I basically got involved on the Sabre project with them from V2 on. This is the V5, and basically moulded it more and more towards a kind of British spec infantry sabre, and it's called the 1796 Infantry because it's based on the 1796 Light Cavalry sabre, but reduced down to infantry proportions, which is what a lot of infantry officers were carrying. So it looks like a Light Cavalry sabre, but it's a bit shorter and a good bit lighter. That's what this represents. This is the first one ever, and it was a few years ago now. And you notice the only damage it's taken is that the quillen has bent there a bit, which it could be hammered back down. That's obviously taking a good few hits, well, a lot of hits there to get it down there. But yeah, this is my personal one, and the first one ever, and it's really going strong. Introduce now the V5 Sharp Simulator. So with these kind of teeth, it looks like the kind of wavy blades that you see used, particularly in the Renaissance, but also onwards, that often get called flamberge, flambard, and that kind of thing. But they're basically wavy blades or teeth, or basically toothed blades. And there's speculation as to why, but I'm not even going to go into that because that's not what this is. This is not done for show, and it's not done for damage or anything like that. It is called a Sharp Simulator for the very reason that it's intended to simulate a sharp blade. Now, the reason for that is that when you have a blunt, safe training sword, you have really thick edges. And that is especially the case with a synthetic, because the material obviously is so light, it's made much thicker to give a realistic weight. Because this is a realistic weight, it's about 700 grams, which is quite typical for an infantry sabre of the Napoleonic period. So the edges are really, really thick. Now on a sharp sword, obviously the edges are very thin, at least at the point where it is sharpened. Now, this does vary historically. Some swords were sharpened their entire length. Some were essentially thin but unsharpened until about the halfway point. Some actually had really thick dumbbell sections for a while, or square sections and all sorts before they went to a sharp edge. So there's a huge amount of variety. Although I'd say if you look into Napoleonic era sabres, they tend to be a thin edge, if not sharp, for the length. And what that means is if you have two edges that are very thin and they bite into one another, well, they connect. I've actually jumped ahead of myself there. They connect with one another edge to edge, then you will get a certain amount of bite and they kind of stick to one another, because obviously when a very thin edge meets a very thin edge, it's actually going to cut into the blade and create those kind of burrs that we see on even on training swords, but it's worse with sharps because the edges are so incredibly thin. That is why a thick edge is desirable on a training sword. It's not just about stopping it from being sharp to hurt your opponent, it's about maintaining an edge that is safe for a prolonged period, doesn't get chewed and burred up. That's why a sort of minimum 2mm edge is kind of ideal, and sometimes a bit more. Anyway, let's go back to this. So you have this biting effect. Why does it happen in the fight? Well, because commonly swords meet edge to edge. Now, this obviously varies depending on individual styles, techniques, and all kinds of things. But when we're talking about the era of kind of parry-riposte fencing, of saber fencing, spadroon broadsword, the methods were people are typically cutting with the front edge of their sword, which is this one, and the parries are made with that edge on, and the manuals explicitly say that, so that you angle your ward iron or knuckle bow towards the parry, which means you are going to be meeting edge to edge very often in a saber fight. So this scenario of edge meets edge is a common occurrence with these kind of weapons, and largely, most kinds of swords, to be honest, it's a common occurrence. And yeah, when they connect, they bite into one another, and what that means is they kind of stop dead. They don't slide very easily up and down the blade, and it's like a dead impact. And I don't know if probably most people haven't tried it, but if you if you try this at a distance, and I don't recommend it at home, but we've done a few tests, again, safely and under the right conditions, where you strike edge onto edge of sharp swords. Yes, there is that binding effect. We have tried it, but as I said, don't try it at home. Take my word for it. and yeah, it does do that. Now, training swords are, as I said, blunt, or they bloody well should be. And when training swords meet, they tend to have a bit of slide and potentially a bit of bounce. Now, that's a problem not just with synthetics, but with steel. It's better with steel, but blunt steel still has some of these issues. And synthetics do bounce just that little bit more. Depending on the sword and the style, it varies in terms of how much it affects the fight. Personally, for a saber like this, I don't really mind that bounce too much. I use about 50-50 mix in my training between this synthetic and my steels, so I like them both. But it is really interesting to be able to spar and simulate that edge contact, because it does change certain factors. Not so much that it's detrimental, but it's just interesting to be able to occasionally use it. So when I bought these, I never intended for them to replace my standard V5 saber, and they haven't. I use them as they're a good loner sword, because they do iron out certain bad habits, and I use them occasionally just so that people can understand the shop simulator sort of concept. And they do work. So when these meet, obviously if they meet a normal blade, the effect isn't so good because it can still slide this way, but it does lock it this way. So even if you use one sharp sim against a normal training sword, you do get half of the effect of the sharp simulator. And not only does it stop the movement, it also, I've found, stops some of the bounce. And that's probably because of the way it kind of locks together. So if I now look at a pair of them, because I bought a pair of these, so if you now see where they connect, they basically lock up, down, and forwards and backwards. But if one of them pivots so that the flat comes on, suddenly you can slide again. And that also makes certain techniques really, really interesting. So a good example would be cart over the arm, which you normally start cart over the arm, engage with the true edge on, apply pressure, and then pivot or rotate so that the back, which in this case is a completely blunt back edge on this kind of sword, goes onto the opponent's blade as your thrust goes through. Now, in the Roth manual, this is described as a means of thrusting around your opponent's guard. It's a sneaky way to use the point. And when you use the sharp sims for it, it works so much better, because when two people lock like this, it's kind of locks them both in position, and they feel kind of safe in that position. The opening would obviously be on the other side, but where they are, they feel secure, and you can pivot and slide in a way that is really quite interesting and pretty representative of things that do happen with sharp swords. So not only are you making advantage of the sharp simulated edges, you're then making advantage of the non-sharp simulated edges and the change between the two. So that's really quite fascinating. So what else could I say about these? Well, you can tell that they're made slightly differently. They have this very, very thin fuller rather than the wide fuller of the standard model. And because of the way they've been made, they've come out a little bit lighter, maybe about 30-40 grams, I remember, all in the blade. So they're a bit lighter and a bit faster than the standard infantry model. I wasn't expecting that, but it's not so much a problem. I mean, there were huge variety historically. If you look at the antiques, you'll find massive variety in weight, size, curvature, all those things. I don't mind it so much. I would have preferred them to have been a little bit heavier, but I think these were the first they ever made of this model. And, you know, talk to Black Fencer if you want them heavier or lighter, whatever else, they will tend to make whatever you fancy within reason. And, okay, so any concerns? Well, the hilt is exactly the same as the standard V5 saber, so there's nothing to be said about that. So I've constantly given them advice on how to model this after British sabers of the time, and I'm really happy now that it works exactly as it should, so really happy with those. So let's just talk about the blade. As I said, it's a little bit lighter, not a big deal. It also flexes a little bit more, that's kind of useful. But this sharp simulated edge, I was concerned when I first bought them that would snag on equipment, particularly things like gloves. So gloves tend to easily snag on things and pull and rip and tear and all these kind of things. And if you've got training swords that are increasing the wear or increasing the risk of damage to safety equipment, that is clearly not ideal. And that's why I was a little bit concerned about these. I thought these notches might do that. Now, we've had these, I believe, now 2 years, perhaps even maybe 3, and which is ridiculous. I haven't done a review until now, but We got there eventually. So far, we have seen none of those effects. These have had tons of use, absolutely tons of use, in my hands and in others, because I loan them out all the time. I'm happy to throw them to people in the club to use as loaners, but also to experience the sharp simulated effect. And yeah, we've seen no wear, no damage, nothing like that. So, I mean, you want to do more tests, but so far we've not seen any problems whatsoever, which is really nice to see. So, would I necessarily replace my standard training swords with the sharp simulators? I don't think so. I think maybe you focus a little bit too much on certain elements when you use these, so I feel that they're kind of a specific training tool for a specific part of the fight, if you know what I mean. So you practice, well, like you say in longsword, where they do all the winding or Vinden drills, where you're just locking into binds and winding from there. I think to some degree that's what this is. It's a training tool for a specific element of the fight, which you can't always practice with a blunt safe simulator. And because they're synthetics, they're cheap enough that you can buy a pair of them in to just use as an occasional tool to experience that extra factor. Because if you had to buy these in steel as just to practice that one element, obviously it's prohibitively expensive. But yeah, the black fences are very reasonable. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend these. And I noticed that the sharp simulator stops here, and you don't have it on the back. That's interesting to mention that British military sabres were almost never sharpened on the back. Almost never. It's very, very rare to see. So, which is why there's no sharp simulated here. Because on some sabres, of course, very famously, some Hussar-type sabres have a sharpened section here, sometimes called a Yelman, so it's basically flares out and sharpens on the back edge. That's although some British swords do flare there, they're not sharp. So yeah, really unusual to see a sharpened back edge on a British sabre of this kind, although you will see it on other British swords, particularly some back swords and stuff like that. Yeah, so that is the 796 Infantry Sharp Simulator. I think it's a really interesting training tool. If you can have a go with it at any point, I think just to have these two in the club is enough, because people can just pick them up and use them anytime. If you see me at events, when events actually ever happen again, just come and talk to me. I've probably got these on me, and you can give them a go and see what you think, because I think they're a bit of a blast. So yeah, there's a product review a little bit late, but it is now there. I think they're really good fun, and I do recommend them. I do hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so.